Welcome to your Daily 5 for Tuesday, February 6th, 2024. I watched a 1982 slasher film that has had at least 3 titles, including the one that I watched it under. The original title, when it was released, I believe, in the UK before it came to the US, was Pranks. Then it was changed. Well, the filmmakers wanted it to be Death Dorm, but apparently the distributor in the United States didn't like that title and changed it to The Dorm That Dripped Blood. And the title that it had when I watched it was Death Dorm. So they've now changed it back for, I guess, the uncut permanent release or whatever. In any event, this is a film that, as I said, came out in 1982. And this was at the early part, really, of the surge of slasher films that followed Friday the 13th, which was released, I believe, in 1980. I think it was 80 or late 79, but I'm pretty sure it's officially billed as 80. So this, as you would expect, Friday the 13th made a bunch of money, and anytime a movie makes a bunch of money, you're going to have a bunch of movies that try to copy it. And this movie is often lumped in as an imitator of Friday the 13th. And to some degree, you can figure out why. I mean, it does follow a killer that is stalking young people and kind of murdering them in creative ways one by one until you get down to just the one person left. But honestly, I don't think that's really fair to it. I actually think this movie is better than a lot of other people do. This movie doesn't have a very high rating. It sits at, I think it's maybe at a 5 on IMDb, and then I think it's got a 0%. Although, the Rotten Tomatoes thing doesn't mean anything. I don't even know why I quote that. But in general, there is not a high favorable review of this movie or a high favorable opinion of it in a lot of places. And I honestly think that's unfair because I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's some kind of magical unknown gem, not something that I would tell people they had to rush out and see. But it did not work in the way I expected it to based on the reputation and the things that people said about it. This is not a boring by-the-numbers slasher flick. It actually tries to do some things differently, including an ending that is unusual for films of this time, or at least not what you might expect based on what people say about it. Now, I should say a lot of people do reference the fact that it has a very interesting ending, but movies of this time followed a certain formula when they were actually ripping off the Friday the 13th idea. It would get down to one person, and that one person would probably defeat the killer in some kind of, inventive way. The killer would come back a couple times and finally be defeated, at least for that film. That's what you expect to happen, and that's not what happens in The Dorm That Dripped. I'm just going to call it Death Dorm. It's easier. In Death Dorm. And also, the way that the characters are, which again is unusual for movies like this, I actually cared about these characters to some degree. Don't get me wrong, they're not really well written, they're not deep characters, they are pretty superficial, but there was something about the way the movie was constructed where I actually felt bad for the people that I knew were eventually almost all going to get killed, if not all going to get killed. In a movie like this, you know what's going to happen to a large degree. And I'm not going to tell you that Death Dorm defies every expectation at every turn. It does largely follow the traditional slasher model in the broad strokes. But it also does, as I said, interesting things. Now, in the interest of keeping it spoiler-free, in case anybody wants to watch it and see it for themselves, I won't get too much further into it until the Friday show. But I would actually recommend this to people. Don't be put off by the fact that a lot of people write this movie off as just another Friday the 13th imitator. I've seen people say that it's boring. I didn't find it to be boring. It does take its time. And maybe that's the thing, is people are used to slashers where somebody's getting killed every 10 minutes. And that's not what this movie does. This movie takes its time with things, and I think it works for the movie's benefit. May not be the case for everybody who watches it. Some people may find it boring, but I've watched boring slasher films, which you wouldn't think. Some of these are with really creative kills, and yet they still are just boring. I was watching this movie trying to see where it was going because it wasn't taking the usual path. And that, at least for at least one watch, I can't tell you that you'd have the same experience watching it twice. I don't know if I'll ever watch it again. I might not. But I actually found this one to be entertaining in the things it did differently. It didn't suddenly break the mold of slasher films. I'm not going to pretend it did, but it did enough things in its own way that I think it is worth seeing. So, don't spend $200 to see it or anything like that. It's pretty easily available. You can find it in a lot of places, and including on YouTube in its entirety. But I would say if you're into slasher films, especially in the 80s, you probably will actually enjoy this at least once. So again, 1982's Death Dorm or The Dorm That Dripped Blood may not be the greatest thing you've ever seen, but I think it is worth watching. Later.